Hey everyone, not dead yet here. My friend Ethan Harold and I were talking about the Roy Jones Jr. Mike Tyson fight the other day, and he told me that I should do a video on it. I figured I wasn't going to, because there's already a bunch of videos on this topic of who would win and what their styles are. I'll link two very good videos by the modern martial artists if you guys are interested. It's where I draw some of the information I'm taking for this video. But I was watching the weigh-ins today, and honestly I decided, you know what? I'll make a video on it. Why not? Ethan said he was interested in hearing my thoughts, so you know what? Why not? I'll put my thoughts out into the void. I'd like to put a little bit of a disclaimer here. This isn't going to be a completely complex breakdown of Mike Tyson or Roy Jones Jr.'s styles. Again, there are plenty of those on the internet already, and probably ones way better than I could ever do. I just don't have the time and effort to do the research for it right now, to be quite honest. So what this video is going to be is basically just me giving my thoughts on the fight, and not necessarily who I think will win, but how I believe each fighter will go about winning if he were to win, so to speak. What each fighter would have to do to win the fight, and maybe some of the factors and variables that come into play when discussing Roy Jones Jr. versus Mike Tyson. So to start this off, the whole thing's an exhibition match. Everybody knows that. What is an exhibition match? What does it mean? An exhibition match is basically a demo, but with another club. What is a demo? A demo in boxing is when two fighters of the same club put on a fight at an event, basically just to spar. It's a glorified sparring session to show off the sport, show off the skills of the two fighters, and no winner is declared. Because again, it's simply a demo. Demo stands for demonstration. An exhibition is basically just a demo, but with two fighters from opposite clubs fighting each other. It is not meant to be a genuine competition to see who can knock the other person out, but more so just a general showcase of skills and the sport of boxing. However, there is big debate over whether these two titans of the boxing industry can actually have an exhibition. People are very curious how serious each fighter is going to take it, right? Because again, sure, there may not be an official winner, but if one person knocks out the other, I'm pretty sure most people will say that that fighter won. So what do I think? I honestly do not know. I do not know what each fighter is thinking going into this. Based off of the interviews, I think both fighters are going to take it at least relatively seriously. I don't know if they're going to go for knockouts, but I think that both fighters are going to take this seriously enough to show that they still have the skills necessary to step into the ring, that they still belong in the ring. I don't think we're going to see two people dance around the ring just poking at each other for however long the fight is. I think we will see real shots meant to do some level of serious damage, whether it's a serious knockout or meant to just hurt the person and show, hey, you know, I may be in my 50s, but I still got power, like don't count me out just yet. I do think that we will see both fighters take this seriously to an extent. For the sake of this video, I am going to assume that both fighters are trying to knock each other out. That way we can really go into what each fighter would have to do to achieve that knockout. So let's get the obvious out of the way. Who do I think has the advantage in this fight? And honestly speaking, with everything that I've seen, generally, very generally, I would give Roy Jones Jr. the advantage by a smidge, a tiny advantage. But that's just kind of because of what his style is. Now, Mike Tyson and Roy Jones Jr. actually have very similar styles when you look at it. Both of them are multi-stance fighters that cut hard angles and weird angles to slip in punches past an opponent's guard that they wouldn't otherwise see coming. The main difference between the two fighters is that Mike Tyson channels all those angles and that multi-stanced footwork and head movement into aggression. He uses it to pressure his opponents and get in close, whereas Roy Jones Jr. is a lot more relaxed with his application of this fighting style. He tends to kind of lean back, stay back a bit more, pick at his opponents, and then have bursts, quick bursts of calculated aggression. I also find that Roy Jones Jr. is a lot more flashy than Mike Tyson. Mike Tyson tends to be a little bit more straightforward in his boxing style, sticking hard to the basics with things like Cus D'Amato's peekaboo style. A good example of this difference in application of similar boxing theory can be seen when each fighter cuts a hard angle around their opponent. Mike Tyson uses these hard angles to set up devastating uppercuts and hooks, whereas Roy Jones Jr. uses them to keep himself safe and protected as he exits exchanges. But that's just the grand overview of the style, the template, if you will. Now, obviously, Mike Tyson and Roy Jones Jr. take that template and apply them very differently, and I'm sure what you guys are here for, what you're interested in, are my thoughts on how Roy Jones Jr.'s more back foot heavy outboxer style of boxing will compare to Mike Tyson's more front foot heavy bull charge, bull rush, infighter style of boxing. Well, let's start with what each fighter is going to have to do. Roy Jones Jr. stands 1 inch taller than Mike Tyson. And what Roy Jones is going to have to do is, obviously, this is the obvious stuff. I'm not claiming to be a genius when it comes to this proclamation. Is going to have to keep Mike Tyson away. He's going to have to keep him at the end of his reach and do his best to not get caught on the ropes. Mike Tyson, on his end, is going to have to do the exact opposite. He's going to have to pressure Jones and try and keep him on the ropes or in the corner at all costs. So why did I give the edge to Roy Jones Jr.? Well, the answer actually comes in the form of stamina. Roy Jones Jr.'s style is actually way better suited to a long and drawn out fight. It is no secret that if Roy Jones Jr. is going to win this fight, he is going to need to draw the fight out and tire Mike out. Mike's style is very reliant on early round aggression to land a solid finishing blow early before he tires out, and Roy Jones Jr.'s style is not really built to fight like that. Roy Jones Jr.'s style favors a long and drawn out boxing match, especially with things like his most well-known stuff, like putting his hands behind his back and his signature punch that the modern martial artist so lovingly called the dive bomb, where he throws out both his hands, leads with his chin, and then fires off a punch to knock out his opponent out. What allows him to do this is the fact that he would build upon things that he would do early on in the rounds, like using his cross hand as a jab to establish power, and the fact that a power punch could come from literally anywhere, right? If the opponent didn't know that and didn't respect his power and know that a knockout punch could come from literally everywhere, Roy Jones Jr. throwing out both his arms like this would almost guarantee a knockout, him getting knocked out, not the other person, because the other person wouldn't be weary of his power and would jump at the opportunity to attack his exposed chin. But the problem here, especially the problem with the dive bomb, as again, really good breakdown by the modern martial artist, linked in description, look at it. I'm not going to go into it too far here, but takes advantage of the fact that the opponent is scared of both Roy Jones Jr.'s skill and his power. And there are two things here that make it so that Mike Tyson might have a slight advantage over other fighters in this regard. Number one being Mike Tyson isn't scared. You know, that's something as simple as that. Maybe he is not afraid to take the shot to the head. And if he's not afraid to take the shot to the head, he'll be more willing to sacrifice a blow to the temple if he can land a good devastating hook to Roy Jones Jr.'s chin. But also, he takes away a little bit of the unpredictability of the dive bomb with his signature peekaboo style. Because one of the things the dive bomb is good for is that because Roy Jones Jr. keeps his hands down by his waist, he tends to throw looping punches that can change direction at any moment. You'll be blocking what you think is a hook and suddenly you'll catch an uppercut to the ribs, or vice versa. You think you're blocking a body shot and then suddenly a punch comes over top and hits you in the temple. Roy Jones Jr. is unpredictable, which allows him to kind of fling his arms out like that and not get countered because the boxers that he's fighting don't really know what's coming. But the problem with that is the peekaboo style that Mike Tyson uses is based on just general all-around defense, right? And Mike Tyson has some of the best head movement in boxing ever. The really interesting thing for that, the really interesting counter to that, though, is the fact that Roy Jones Jr. has some of the best head tracking in boxing ever. So we have two styles that don't necessarily clash, but are almost made to counter one another, and it's who can pull off their style better than the other. Now, again, the dive bomb is a very powerful technique, but it's also very risky. It leaves Roy Jones Jr. very open, and Mike Tyson is just the type of person to capitalize on those weaknesses and take Jr. out. Now, and again, the main thing that keeps Roy Jones Jr. safe is the unpredictability of it and the fear of the fighters and the fear of his power, as previously stated. What the peekaboo style does in terms of taking away his unpredictability cannot be understated. Because as long as Mike Tyson keeps his hands up to about here, he should be fine, right? Because again, the dive bomb is more of a looping overhand type punch. It'll catch someone either on the chin or on the temple, and then it's lights out. But the peekaboo style allows you to protect those areas while still pressing forward. Mike Tyson could probably take the shot on the gloves and just take a step forward to smother Roy Jones Jr.'s dive bomb and then come with an overhand right or hook counter like Mike Tyson is so known to doing, and that could end the fight right there. Again, that is assuming that Mike Tyson at this point in the fight, because I do not suspect that Jones is going to use the dive bomb right out the gate. This is something that Jones needs to build up to. So this is also assuming that Mike Tyson has the stamina to continue to pressure in the ways that he would in the earlier rounds. Let's move on to Tyson now, though. Let's leave Roy Jones Jr. alone for a little bit and move on to Tyson and talk about stamina. Mike Tyson's style is very stamina draining, and his first loss to Buster Douglas was because Douglas wasn't scared of Tyson's power, was willing to fight him toe-to-toe and slowly wear him down over a long fight. And if Roy Jones Jr. can do that, or at the very least escape Tyson for the vast majority of the rounds and get him to, say, you know, the 6th round. I don't even know how many rounds are in this fight. Give me a second to look it up. Okay, so I just looked over the rules, and it is going to be 8 2-minute rounds, which actually favors Tyson a little bit more. Roy Jones Jr. is definitely going to need to draw this fight out to the later rounds, you know, maybe even the 7th or 8th, to really tire Tyson out and exhaust him and take that knockout. I'm not saying he can't do it, but this definitely tips the fight more in Tyson's favor. 2-minute rounds is not a lot of time. You do not have a lot of time to really set things up like you would in, say, a 12-round, 3-minute long round title fight, right? So Roy Jones Jr. can't really play the short game here. He's going to need to pressure Tyson a little bit. So that doesn't necessarily mean I revoke what I said before. Roy Jones Jr. does have strategies that he can use to drain Mike Tyson's strength and make him a little bit more tired as the fight goes on, but this tips things a little bit slightly. The fight is definitely going to be a lot more of a sprint than a marathon. But anyway, back to Tyson's style. Tyson, if he's going to win this fight, a lot of people say he's going to have to pressure him in the early rounds before he gets tired, and I agree with that. I agree that if Tyson is going to win this fight, he is going to need to pressure Jones early before Jones can get into his rhythm, because once Jones gets into his rhythm, he is an amazing boxer, incredibly skilled, and you do not want to let him set up. So what Tyson is going to have to do is he's going to have to charge in, use his head movement to kind of get Jones onto the ropes, which is a place where Jones does not want to be, because while Jones is generally pretty good at escaping the ropes, his method of cutting angles and turning the opponent to get out might actually work a little bit more in Tyson's favor and allow Tyson to set up those devastating uppercuts and hooks and keep Jones on the ropes or seriously hurt him as he leaves in exchange. So Jones is going to have to try and stay off the ropes at all costs while trying to wear down Tyson. Tyson's main goal in the early rounds of this fight should be interrupting Jones's rhythm, making sure that he can't make himself comfortable, he can't reliably set himself up and kind of move the way he wants. Tyson is going to have to take control of this fight right from the get-go, set the pace, and maintain the pace, because if he doesn't, he will let Jones do that, and that is when Jones will be able to truly kind of be like a matador with a bull. The bull charges in, attempting to overpower the matador, and the matador just sidesteps and moves away. The bull is harmless. Now, I'm not saying that's a massive oversimplification of Tyson's style. Tyson, I believe doesn't get the respect he deserves as an intelligent boxer. Everything from foot positioning to his multi-stance style to how he sets up power blows is incredibly intelligent. And like I said, Roy Jones Jr. is going to have a difficult fight ahead of him, especially if Tyson comes out at the get-go, like I said. And again, his style seems specific. His style and his mentality especially seem very, very tailored to countering Roy Jones, especially with the way he uses his style by putting his hands behind his back and his signature dive bomb. Taking those away from Jones might just be enough for Tyson to just knock Jones out flat. Jones is a good fighter. He has power behind his hands, but he is more focused on speed, whereas Tyson is more focused on power. And we want to see, what a lot of people are questioning is what has left first, Tyson's power or Jones's speed. Because again, a lot of the time you'll see Roy Jones Jr. just teeing off on certain fighters, racking up points, and eventually just battering them into submission. But I don't think that'll work too well on Tyson. He may land 1 or 2 shots, maybe 3 or 4, but Tyson will counter, and those counters hurt a lot. And each time you get hit by a powerful counter, it can reduce your speed. You will get tired. So those are the key things that I want you to take away from the styles of each fighter and how each fighter could counter one another. Roy Jones Jr. is quick on his feet and able to kind of sidestep and move away from Tyson, who is desperately trying to pin Jones against the ropes. However, Tyson is a smart and adept fighter who can very well, very feasibly pin Roy Jones Jr. against the ropes. And if that does happen, right, it's a matter of can Roy Jones Jr. escape the ropes without getting seriously hurt in the process. Again, it's a matter of power versus speed, amazing head movement versus amazing head tracking. And again, when it comes to power shots, it's flashy boxing versus straight boxing. Roy Jones Jr. takes the basics of boxing and throws them out the window. He puts his hands down, he throws punches from weird angles, he builds up to that and makes it so that his opponents fear him so that he can get away with some of this shit. Mike Tyson doesn't do that. Mike Tyson's the exact opposite, actually. Mike Tyson is the basics of boxing polished to a dangerous degree, which is chin down, elbows in, hands up, guard up, rush through, be fearless. And Mike Tyson's impenetrable defense versus Roy Jones's risky dive bomb might just be the thing that wins Tyson the fight. The little advantages that Mike Tyson's peekaboo style and fearless attitude grant him might be enough to overcome Roy Jones Jr.'s skill, reflexes, and flashy style to win him the fight. Now there's one more thing I'd like to touch upon before I wrap up this video, and that is biological factors. Other things that come into play aside from just pure boxing style, and these are just random variables that I think will have an effect on the match. I'm gonna give kind of my thoughts, but none of these are very concrete. This is just me kind of talking about other things that affect the fight, right? One, Roy Jones Jr. Has the height advantage. He is 5'11", Mike Tyson is 5'10". Now, that may not seem like a lot, but 1 inch is an inch. And in a game of seconds and inches, having whatever advantage you can is definitely something you want to hold on to. And now here's the thing. I don't necessarily think height is a pure advantage unless you know how to use it, and Roy Jones Jr. definitely does. I actually read somewhere that Roy Jones Jr. has surprisingly long arms for his frame, which makes it hard for you to gauge distance from him. You think you're safe, and then boop, you get hit by a jab because his arms are just a little bit longer than they should be. I don't know if that's true or not, but if it is, it definitely plays into helping him with his style. But let's talk about what a lot of people are kind of wondering, and that's age. Because I did say that stamina was a key factor in who is going to win this fight, and that is why I originally said that Roy Jones Jr. might smidge this out on stamina. The last time Roy Jones Jr. fought was, I think, in like 2018, whereas Mike Tyson hasn't been in the ring in over 15 years. If you look at the Joe Rogan podcast, and I'm pretty sure Roy Jones Jr. actually touched upon this himself when he was on the Joe Rogan podcast, but when Mike talked about him filming that video of him hitting the pads and going, you know, I'm back, and he's like, oh, I was in bed for a week after that, and then Roy Jones Jr. looked at that and said, well, you know, like, yeah, I'm a little bit, you know, not as in a good a fight shape as I was, but, you know, I could do that and not be in bed for a week. That might seriously affect it, right? Like I said, sure, the 8 2-minute round fight would have would definitely favor Mike Tyson a little bit more because Roy Jones Jr. can't draw it out like he would in, say, a 12-round title fight. Mike Tyson might just not have the stamina to keep up with 8 2-minute rounds. It is still a sprint. You know, it is still very tiring to try and keep up a hard pace for 8 rounds, especially if it's only 2 minutes and you have to give it everything you have for those 2 minutes. Mike Tyson might overexert himself in those 2 minutes and tire out quicker, and Roy Jones Jr. might be able to capitalize on that. A big counter to that, though, is the fact that Mike Tyson is a natural heavyweight. In his prime, Roy Jones Jr. had to come up to heavyweight, and people seriously debated how much that actually affected his speed and stamina. So, the big question is the fact that Roy Jones Jr. is a little bit fresher off the fight game, but not a natural heavyweight, enough to balance out the fact that Mike Tyson is a natural heavyweight, but has been out of the sport for, you know, over 15 years. I don't know. It's something I want to bring up and muse to you guys, and you guys can talk about it in the comment section below if anybody happens to stumble across this video. But yeah, that's something I wanted to bring up. And there's also the idea of age. How much has age had an effect on these boxers? Because we see them train, we see them hitting the pads, and they look great on the pads, but the pads and the bag are not the ring. They are two different things entirely. And sure, you may have great stamina on the bag, great stamina on the pads, and even great stamina in sparring, actually, but once you step into the ring to actually fight, it becomes an entire matter altogether. And again, maybe I'm overstating this a little bit, because both these guys are world champions with multiple belts to their name. Like, this is I'm not talking about some amateur who's never fought before. I am talking about Roy Jones Jr. and Mike Tyson. So these guys definitely know what it's like to be in the ring and know what it's like to mitigate the stress and fears and anxieties that you get when you step into the ring. However, I do think it is a variable that comes into play that could affect the fight if we're looking at things not purely from a boxing style standpoint and more of a this is the reality of the situation standpoint. So in conclusion, those are really all of my thoughts on it. I think it's going to be a good fight either way. I think that ultimately, if you put a gun to my head and said, what do you think of this fight? Who do you think is going to win? I can't really give the fight to either fighter. My analysis of it is both fighters are evenly matched, and that each style, that the fighter of each style, and that the style of each fighter, there we go, is made almost specifically to counter the toolkit of the other, and that at the end of the day it's going to come down to things like biological factors of how, you know, ring rust and age have caught up to these fighters, and who just simply implements their fighting style better. And honestly speaking, I am super excited to see it. I am a big fan of both of these fighters. I'm excited to see both of these legends in the ring again, and it's just going to be an exciting fight. It's a great thing for boxing. You know, people are talking about boxing again. People are getting excited about boxing again. This is one of the first real super fights we've had in a while, especially since Wilder v. Fury. So yeah, it's going to be a lot of fun. I'm excited for it. I hope, despite the fact that this whole video may have come off as incoherent ramblings of a guy who definitely wasn't prepared to film a video today, I hope you managed to learn at least something. If you did, please drop a like, subscribe. I've got more boxing, fitness, and overall fun content on the way. And until then, I'm not dead yet, and if you aren't either, there's always a tomorrow waiting for you, and you'd best be excited for that tomorrow, because that tomorrow, or I guess today by the time I upload this video, is Mike Tyson versus Roy Jones Jr.